Let me welcome you to the session which is looking at British foreign policy in the 1950s and the 1960s, aptly entitled No Longer Top Dog. My name's Adrian Smith, and apologies if this is on the third occasion today where you've had to listen to my voice. I'm Professor of Modern History at Southampton, and as I say, I'll be chairing today and hopefully not saying too much because we obviously want to hear from our two panelists, our distinguished guests, and most importantly from yourselves, in that we will leave plenty of time for you to ask questions and to contribute to discussion. So our two panelists are Kathleen Burk. She is Emerita Professor of International History?
Modern and Contemporary.
Multi-contemporary, yes.
Gives me scope.
At UCL, and is a truly Renaissance woman insofar as she has written on a whole variety of topics, from viticulture to a biography of A.J.P. Taylor, and appears frequently on radio and television, most notably, I think, on In Our Time, as recently as last week. She has written two very big books on Anglo-American relations, and I think is currently writing a third one, and so is particularly well qualified to discuss this afternoon's topic. And so too, of course, is Vernon Bogdanor, who was formerly a professor of government at University of Oxford and now has a chair at King's College London. In many respects, Vernon Bogdanor is the doyen of studying the British Constitution. You sort of feel on today that if there's going to be a discussion on something related to the great unwritten British Constitution, then it's a toss-up. It'll either be Peter Hennessy or it will be Professor Bogdanor. But of course, his work looks well beyond Westminster and Whitehall, and has always had a clear global dimension, which makes him equally well qualified to contribute to this event. So what we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to ask Professor Burk if she would like to talk for about 5 minutes or so, and then Vernon Bogdanor is going to follow on for another 5 minutes. Then we'll have a little bit of time of conversation between the two of them, taking up points that have emerged in those initial presentations, and then after that I shall open up to discussion to all of you, and there'll be the opportunity for questions and contributions from the floor. So without further ado, turn to Kathleen Burk.
I should warn you that I was told 5 to 8 minutes, so it's closer to 8
Right,
than
okay.
it is to 5.
Well, we'll show a little bit of latitude here, I think.
Yes, that's what they said, actually. For the patriotic Britain, I should warn you I'm being attacked by a frog, so I may have to stop and have a glass of water. For the patriotic Britain, the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the end of empire is not a happy topic. While it's not precisely a tale of decline, degradation, and death, its British foreign policy this period is undoubtedly one of decline and a touch of degradation. The context was British financial and economic decline and the relationship with the United States. I'll look at each briefly and then consider the Suez Crisis and its consequences. First of all, to have a foreign policy of any significance, you have to be able to pay for it. And from the beginning of the 1950s to the end of the 1970s, the British economy was in increasingly dire straits. Sterling crises occur when holders of sterling, having grave doubts about the strength of the economy, sold it off. As a result, the value of the pound would plunge, and the Bank of England then had to use its gold reserves to try to support it. Sterling crises became more or less, from the later 1950s, we might say, nearly a yearly event. The combination of a weak pound, public spending deficits, increased borrowing, massive and repeated strikes, and inflation culminated in 1967 with the devaluation of the pound. For our purposes, That signaled the end of empire. A close relationship with the United States had been, since the Second World War, the single most important element in British foreign policy. Indeed, more than one British diplomat used to quote the story of the successful Foreign Office candidate who gave to the question, "What are three things matter most in the world?" the answer, God, love, and Anglo-American relations. For Britain, danger has always come from Europe. And traditionally, whenever a dominant power rose in Europe, the British would ally themselves with the second strongest power, therefore, in order to maintain a balance of power. And after the Second World War, however, there was only one power in Europe, and that was the Soviet Union. Britain had no choice. She had to ally herself closely with the United States in order to protect the security of the home islands. But Britain still had a great empire, and in a stunning strategic transformation, if you remember that there was a revolution, the US supported the continuance of this empire. And as a secret State Department memorandum pointed out in 1948, and I quote, "The United Kingdom, the dominions, colonies, and dependencies form a worldwide network of strategically located territories of great military value, which have served as defensive outposts and as bridgeheads for operations. Subject to our general policy of favoring eventual self-determination of peoples, it is our objective that the integrity of this area be maintained." Or as it was put in 1957 by the head of covert operations from the CIA, "Whenever there is somewhere we want to destabilize, the British have an island nearby." Now, it may be difficult to square this with the ferociously negative American reaction to the Suez Crisis of October to December 1956. But the fact is, the Americans believed that the British and the French and Israelis were destroying any possibility that the peoples of the Middle East would consider the West as the democratic lodestar and would remember only that Britain had been the imperial master of the area. The result the Americans feared was that these countries, and especially Egypt, would turn away from the West and turn instead to the USSR. Briefly, the story is this. In July 1956, the ruler of Egypt, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, whose major shareholder was Great Britain. This was seen as a dangerous threat. First of all, it was fundamental to British sea communications to her colonies in Southeast Asia and to Australia and New Zealand. Of equal, if not greater importance, it was the route for oil from the Persian Gulf. And finally, her base near Cairo in the Suez Canal zone was the center of defense for British positions in the Mediterranean and Africa. In response, the British, French, and Israelis, who had different but complementary strategic needs, decided to invade Egypt, and wrench back control of the canal. The US warned them a number of times that they would not support violence, but the British cabinet did not believe that the US actually meant this. Once the attack began on the 29th of October, it rapidly became clear that she did. President Eisenhower condemned it publicly, and the US Sixth Fleet shadowed and even harassed the Anglo-French task force as it steamed from Malta to Egypt. The pound went into a tailspin, and the US refused to support it, even blocking a loan from the IMF. Oil pipelines were blown up, and the US refused to supply desperately needed oil to make up the loss. After a week, Britain, France, and Israel agreed to a ceasefire, and by the 22nd of December, they had pulled out of Egypt. The repercussions were huge. First of all, the crisis split the nation, and it took time to repair the damage. Secondly, it did irreparable harm to Anglo-American relations, whilst also making it clear that Britain could no longer implement a foreign policy that required military force without at least the acquiescence of the United States. It therefore signaled the end of Britain as a great power. Thirdly, it did severe damage to her reputation amongst many other long-standing allies and friends, Norway as an example. Fourthly, she turned towards Europe with the first application to join the then EEC, made in 1961. And finally, Britain accelerated the withdrawal from empire. During the 1960s, a number of countries in Africa gained their full independence: Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, amongst others. The Americans had no difficulty with this. They were, however, intensely upset at Britain's withdrawal from what was called East of Suez. This area referred to Singapore and Malaysia, the Persian Gulf, Aden, and the Indian Ocean. The Americans appreciated the British bases in Aden and Singapore. They liked having the Union Jack instead of the Stars and Stripes flying in the Persian Gulf and in India, for example. Now, the one they didn't withdraw from was Hong Kong, because this was too useful as a listening station for signals intelligence from China. For Great Britain, it was the end of an era. She had been a global power for 3 centuries, and now she was only a regional power. For their part, the Americans were upset not only because of the general strategic loss represented by British withdrawal, but also because they wanted British support for the Vietnam War. It was difficult being the only prominent Western and largely white power fighting in East Asia. And they wanted British support against domestic and international opposition to the war. But Britain refused. Prime Minister Wilson did not have the support of his parliamentary backbenchers, nor would British public opinion have supported it, as the Grosvenor Square riot, as an attempt was made to storm the American embassy in 1968, made quite clear. President Johnson was incandescent with rage. Could the British not even send a token force? A platoon of bagpipes would be sufficient, he said. It was the British flag that was wanted. The Secretary of State told a British journalist at a cocktail party in Washington that, quote, "All we needed was 1 regiment. The Black Watch would have done. Just 1 regiment, but you wouldn't do it. Well, don't expect us to save you again. They can invade Sussex and we wouldn't do a damn thing about it." This was a very low point indeed for British foreign and defense policy. Adversity ruled, and in the 1970s, the situation grew even worse. Economic strength was vital, and Britain increasingly lacked this strength. Consequently, her importance to her major ally also declined, and the US increasingly turned towards Germany, at least for European and sometimes Soviet affairs. What turned things around for Britain was her successful conduct of the Falklands War in 1982 and the increased strength of her economy in the 1980s. And for 30 years thereafter, she maintained her renewed position as the US's major ally. But by British choice, this era now seems to be drawing to a close. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. And turn to our second speaker.
Thank you very much. As Kathy Burk has implied, the position of Britain as a global power did not derive from her intrinsic strength, nor, in my view, from the possession of an empire, but from her balancing role in Europe and her ability to sway the balance of power in one direction or another, and it's that disappeared in the Second World War. If you look at the last major diplomatic conference before the war, the famous or infamous Munich conference, there were 4 powers present: Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. And Europe was the centre of the world. Now, 10 years later, Britain was the only one of those countries which could be called in any sense even half of a great power, because that traditional role of Britain's had disappeared. She couldn't contain Germany without the help of the United States, and that position, which was revealed starkly at Suez, was also there in 1939 and 40. One of the reasons why Chamberlain's policy towards Germany toughened in 1939 was because he had some assurance of American diplomatic support. and Churchill was clear in 1940 the war couldn't be won without American aid. Now, on the whole, the post-war politicians were not as short-sighted about Britain's position as is often held, though I think the most short-sighted, oddly enough, was the man who's often thought to be the greatest post-war Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, because he tried to maintain untenable positions overseas for far too long, against the wishes on the whole of Attlee, who I think was more realistic. And Anthony Eden was also more realistic. He withdrew from Britain's imperial positions in the Sudan and in the Suez Canal base, and his hope was that British interests could be protected not by empire, but by nationalist leaders who would realize that they had a sympathetic friend in Britain. And of course that hope was undermined by the Suez Crisis of 1956. And I think what upset Eden most about that was it was a clear breach of an agreement, because the agreement by which Britain withdrew from the Suez Canal base in 1954 explicitly emphasized that the canal company would remain as it was under international control, and that agreement was broken 6 weeks after the last British troops left Egypt. And that, of course, reminded Anthony Eden of broken promises in the 1930s. And he never, contrary to what's often said, he never compared Eden with Hitler. He compared Eden with Mussolini, because he thought that Mussolini's breaking of agreements on Ethiopia paved the way for Hitler, and that Nasser's breaking of international rules would pave the way for worse people. And I think that was the main motivation of his actions on Suez. And I think he was the first British statesman, if one calls it that, to appreciate the danger for Britain in the post-war world would come not so much from Soviet communism as from vicious third world dictators. And the history of the Middle East since that period, I think, has shown that he was right. Suez had a strange effect on British public opinion, because people were opposed to it at the beginning, but in a rather quixotic British way, they came to support it after it had clearly failed. It had no, I think, long-term impact on British public opinion, except amongst the intellectual classes. It put them against the Conservatives, but they'd probably have been against the Conservatives anyway. Eisenhower, Nixon and Dulles all thought they'd made a terrible mistake afterwards, because their aim was also that of Eden's, to remove Nasser by force, as they'd removed the Persian leader Dr. Mossadegh by force in 1953, but they disagreed with the means that Eden was using, in particular the collusion with the Israelis. The French were involved in Suez, as the British were, and the German Chancellor, Dr. Adenauer, said to the French, "Europe will be your revenge. You'll get revenge on America if you form an anti-American European bloc," which of course was de Gaulle's idea, supported by Adenauer. And Adenauer, a rather contemptuous view of Britain, said Britain was like an old man who has lost all his property and does not realize it. I'm not sure that was really true, and people say that we should at that point have taken a European orientation, but I think you have to say, whether you are pro-European or anti-European, that the jury is still out on that particular proposition, and I think most people in this room are probably glad that Britain didn't join the Eurozone. But I think that the difficulty is, if we joined earlier, some people say if we joined the coal and steel community early, we could have led Europe and so on, but our economic structure was always different from that of Europe, because we were not primarily an agricultural country, we were a free trade country that got cheap food from Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and the tariff policies of the Europeans were certainly not likely to suit us. But there was a further point which I think is very fundamental in British post-war history and is not noticed when people talk about decline. I think the decline language is overdone. We are not European for a very important reason, that being an island, we were not conquered and we were not subject to fascist or national socialist rule. Now, part of the motivation of the European Union was to overcome the past. That if you live in Germany, if you live in France, if you live in Italy, you may have to be ashamed of what your grandparents did. If you live in Britain because of 1940 and Winston Churchill, you don't feel ashamed, you feel rather proud of what your grandparents did. And that, I think, is a very deep feeling in this country. Contrary to what's often said, I don't think the British people cared one way or another about the empire. There was a Colonial Office survey in 1951 asking people if they could name a single British colony. 59% couldn't name one, though one person did say Lincolnshire. So, I mean, the question of being top dog, I think, was one which worried the British political elite much more than it did the British public. And when I think one looks at the decline of Britain, I think one has to stress the fact that what's now fashionably called soft power, Britain has a lot of that, and a great deal of prestige, certainly much more than countries on the continent. And unlike countries on the continent, we remain a highly stable democracy comparable with Scandinavia rather than with the major countries on the continent. We don't have any Front National. We don't have any extreme parties of left and right. We remain a deeply constitutional country. And I wonder if that sense in which we have really declined, whether in that sense we're not still a great power, and that all the talk about decline affects the position of diplomats and politicians who like being at the top table. The British public couldn't care less. They were probably never very interested in empire. They never wanted to be at the top table. And they preserved a civilized and liberal constitutional state without any threats to its stability throughout the post-war period, including in times of some economic difficulty. And that can't be said of many of the continental countries. And perhaps, although I've criticised Ernest Bevin, perhaps he was right when the proposals for the coal and steel community came to him, which meant the British Parliament would be subordinate to a high authority on the continent. Perhaps Bevin was right to say that inside that Pandora's box, you'll find a lot of Trojan horses. And perhaps that's a lesson of British engagement with Europe. It's destroyed a number of prime ministers, primarily conservative ones. It could destroy another. And it destroyed the Labour Party in the 1980s. Perhaps it would have been better if we'd never heard of Europe at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, interesting and somewhat contentious remarks there. I should be interested to hear the questions in a moment. I think we're all relieved that, thank God, we haven't surrendered Skegness. There was a very sort of, I would say, implicitly, perhaps explicitly generous assessment of Anthony Eden there. A Prime Minister who doesn't normally attract accolades. I wondered whether you wanted to comment.
If you forget Suez for a moment and look at Anthony Eden's record, he was Foreign Secretary for almost the whole of the 20 years between 1935 and 1955. His judgment on every issue was absolutely right. He was opposed to the policy of appeasement, the attempt to deal to make personal deals with Mussolini, and he said that if you allow countries to break the rules of international order, you will face serious challenges later on. Chamberlain said, you're wrong, I can get a deal with Mussolini, and that will not only deter Mussolini, but also deter Hitler, because Mussolini was on Britain's side. That was clearly wrong. He took the view in 1941, when he saw Stalin for the first time, that it was better to get an agreement with Stalin recognizing the status quo while Russia was weak, because you'll have to pay a much higher price than later, which was right. He was right in the 1950s not to support the Americans to defend the French in Indochina, which would have led to indescribable troubles, as we later saw. And the Americans then wanted to get their revenge on him, I think, in part at the time of Suez. He played the leading part in committing British troops to the continent in the early 1950s, and after the wreck of the European defence community, which I think could never have worked, in getting the Western European Union together on a looser basis. He was, it's true, hostile to any engagement with the supranational schemes on the continent. And he was, I think, not untypical of Conservative ministers at that time. And I will read a quotation he said at the time, which you may find of interest. He was getting an honorary degree at Columbia University in 1952, when the Americans were trying, as they are now, to push Britain into a European orientation. And he said, if you drive a nation to adapt procedures which run counter to its instincts, you weaken and may destroy the motive force of its action. You will realize that I'm speaking of the frequent suggestions that the United Kingdom should join a federation on the continent of Europe. This is something which we know in our bones we cannot do. In other words, it's not a matter of argument, it's a matter of instinct. We cannot join a European federation in which the British Parliament is subordinate to a body on the continent. Now, was he right or was he wrong about that? I leave that to you.
Well, perhaps we can come back to that in a moment. I think the tragedy about Eden surely is the contrast between his record as Foreign Secretary and his record as Prime Minister. But I think even as far as Foreign Secretary, I think when it comes to appeasement, I'd suggest the jury's actually out on that. Kathleen Burk, is there anything you'd want to add with regards specifically to Eden?
Well, he made one mistake he did make with the run-up to Suez, although not specifically Suez. He decided he wanted to be his own Foreign Secretary. Harold Macmillan had been Foreign Secretary before, and he and the American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, got on like a house afire. Eden wanted to do it, and so he made the somewhat colorless Selwyn Lloyd Foreign Secretary. And unfortunately, Dulles and Eden detested each other. So the usual sort of informal discussions, which are part of the whole lubrication of Anglo-American relations, were gone. And Vernon is quite right in terms of what the Americans soon decided about Suez, because President Eisenhower, I think around in 1966, told a friend that the single worst mistake he had made in foreign policy was not to back Britain in Suez. And of course, he doesn't explain why, but it's probably easy enough to assume it's because Britain withdrew. She withdrew. She was withdrawing from east of Suez. She was withdrawing from the empire. She was cutting back her military forces, which meant that the United States was losing their major ally. So you're quite right. The Americans decided rather rapidly that had been an appalling mistake.
Well, we haven't actually referred to collusion yet, but perhaps someone in the audience might like to. I'd like to throw it open to questions from the audience. Thank you. Sorry, I'm terribly sorry. Could you say that again with the microphone?
Well, perhaps the obvious one, shouldn't Eden have consulted the United States? And did he ever regret that later?
I think he was aware that the Americans would be opposed to it. He didn't think they would carry their opposition as far as they did. And lines of communication were not good, which was, I think, mainly the fault of the British government rather than the American, because I think Eisenhower was clear that he was opposed to it. But the difficulty was Eisenhower shared the aim of bringing Nasser down. He shared that view. And the British didn't take Eisenhower's sanctimonious comments about not intervening in the internal affairs of other countries, because he helped bring down the Iranian regime in 1953, and the British took the view that if the Panama Canal was in hostile hands, the American attitude would be rather different. So there was a breakdown in communication, that's true. I think Eden didn't actually decide on the action that he was going to take until quite late in the day, when he was presented with, as it were, a fait accompli by the French, that the Israelis were intending to make an attack and the French were going to support them. Would the British join in on that? I think if that hadn't happened, I think things would be quite different. But the Israelis decided on an attack independently of the British. They were going to attack anyway. The British had foreknowledge of that, but they didn't incite the Israelis to attack. the French were in broad, at that time, alliance with the Israelis and were going to support them. The question was, should Britain act? And Eden took the view, you may say he made a misjudgment, that he took the view that this was a wonderful opportunity for Britain. And it's fair to say, we talk about this in personal terms, but contrary to what was once thought, the cabinet was not kept in the dark. They were perfectly well aware of collusion and supported it. It was a cabinet decision, and I don't believe that any prime minister is able to persuade a cabinet against its wishes. And the foreign secretary was, as Kathy's implied, a fairly weak figure, Selwyn Lloyd, but the others in the cabinet weren't. And it's also fair to say, if you want to defend Eden, he was under pressure from his right wing, which at that time meant Harold Macmillan, who thought that he was himself a bit of an appeaser. And I think it'd be very difficult for a Conservative Prime Minister not to take some sort of action in the face of this humiliation.
Could I add something to that about
please
Eden
do.
and Suez? I don't disagree with anything that Vernon has said. The question of Nasser had been a point of considerable interest to both the CIA and MI6, who out in Egypt were hatching all sorts of plans, including assassination plots. And that particular relationship was important because one thing Eisenhower did with Suez was absolutely to cut off any contact between the British and the American governments. Absolutely. No phone calls, no discussions, no attempts to do anything until Britain would get out. The one exception to that is the Joint Intelligence Committee, which meets. There was the CIA member of that continued to attend. So there was a continuing close relationship on the intelligence side. The Americans told the British time and time again that they would not support a military reaction. They tried to go to, the Americans took it to the United Nations. Short of throwing Eden on the ground and putting a foot on his windpipe and saying, look, you've got to believe it, we don't support it. The Americans, I think, did what they could. I think myself, Harold Macmillan was, I don't know, a pig, shall we say. He was one of the main people in the cabinet that pushed the whole Suez thing. He then was one of the main people in the cabinet that said, oh, well, actually, we're not going to have a pound pretty soon, we'd better get out. And then he colluded with the Americans to make sure Eden did not come back as prime minister. In terms of collusion, the reason that was important is that the June-July agreement on Suez, which the Americans drafted in the State Department, said that if there was an attack by an outside power on any of the Arab countries, the British and the French could go back in to try to help. The point of the Israelis going in, and what they were concerned about was to destroy the Egyptian Air Force. They went in, and then the British and the French said, right, we're going to go in and separate these two. So they shot their way, they tried to get to the Suez Canal base. So Israel was absolutely vital. The problem is they didn't have the economic resources to stand any sort of attack. The French weren't dumb. They got a loan from the IMF before Suez. The British didn't have this forward planning in the way which one might have hoped. And when they needed it, the Americans wouldn't let them have it. So Suez, I do think, is crucial, not only in terms of what happened to the Conservative Party. It was crucial in Anglo-American relations because the Americans knew they needed Britain for all sorts of reasons, and they cut the British a lot of slack. And Britain overstepped the line. And that's the problem with power. Stronger powers get their way.
Can I make another point about Anglo-American relations? That it's often said that Roosevelt played a large part in pushing Britain to decolonize, and Kathy's questioned the point about whether the Americans really did want to see the end of the empire. But, you know, if they did, they were doing us a favour. I mean, people talk about decline of Britain because we haven't got the empire, but does anyone in this room regret we no longer rule India or lots of Africa, or anyone even care that we don't? I'm sure not. You know, anyone who helped us get rid of the empire was doing us a great favour, and I think we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Ian MacLeod, who was the colonial secretary in the early 60s, who pushed ahead very quickly with African decolonisation, so we didn't get bogged down the way the French and the Portuguese and other colonial countries did in trying to retain their empires. I mean, the more the Americans pushed us to get rid of the empire, the greater a favour they would have done us, I think.
Another question. Gentleman there. The microphone?
I just wonder if there's a parallel one can draw with, if you like, current circumstances in the Middle East, and that perhaps I hadn't learned a lesson from 56. Did they have a plan for the post-conflict? If it had been successful, what did Britain, France and Israel expect to happen in Egypt with a future government and somebody overthrowing Nasser?
No, this is a very good question, and there were hopes which were vastly exaggerated that there were opponents of Nasser who'd be more friendly to Britain, who would rule Egypt. I suspect that was complete nonsense, and that there wasn't a happy scenario I could think of, and I suspect the invasion would have strengthened Nasser, particularly when it was linked up with the Israelis, of course at that time great enemies of the Arab states, and the Egyptians thought of Israel as a kind of outpost of British imperialism. So I suspect you're absolutely right in the point you're making, that it wasn't clear what would happen and whether you'd have to have an occupying force again. This, incidentally, was the reason that Enoch Powell was opposed to Suez, because he'd been in the Suez group in 1954. He'd opposed the withdrawal from the Suez Canal base. But he said once that decision was made, the Middle East was lost, because it was ridiculous to think you would come back from Cyprus or Malta and reoccupy the territory when you hadn't been able to stay there in the first place. You'd been driven out by guerrilla warfare and military force. So you ought to be realistic and face the fact you simply lost the Middle East. And if you want to criticise Eden, that might be a sensible proposition, but I think it'd be very difficult for a Conservative leader to take up that position.
This was a great dilemma for the British. What would take place if the Anglo-French expedition was successful and they did seize the canal? Never mind control of the canal zone, what about what would be happening in Cairo? And so what they were trying to do was to encourage dissidents who really weren't there, or weren't there in any sort of number. One of the means they used was a PSYOPS operation working out of Cyprus, headed by Bernard Ferguson, future Lord Ballantrae. The army were the first to recognise that there would be a huge power vacuum, and that the only way in which you could protect Anglo-French troops in the canal zone was if you moved into the rest of Egypt. Well, one thing they ruled out from the start was an invasion from Libya, and so Cordingley, who headed the military expedition, went to see Eden and pointed out the number of divisions that would be required to try and occupy Egypt. And Eden sent him off with a flea in his ear. And then the next time Cordingley met Eden was on the eve of the expedition, when he expected, well, you know, jolly good luck, old boy, and hope everything goes all right. But in fact, Eden tore him off a strip again. And Cordingley later said that he could imagine no circumstance in which a serving British officer would ever be treated in such a way by a minister of the state. So this was a very real problem, and just simply wasn't addressed.
And the lack of support even within the British government. In the Foreign Office, a number of people there wore black armbands with Suez, because they could see that it was just there was no good outcome of it. Britain had maintained its position in Egypt, as it had in most of its colonies, by dealing with local elites, suggestible pashas, as it were. And the Americans, the reason they were so angry, one of the many reasons they were so angry, they saw the rising middle classes as the focus of the future. They were cultivating this, but Britain was concerned about nationalism because of the empire. America was concerned about communists because of the Soviet Union. And so therefore, they thought the only way you could really secure Egypt for the Western side was to make sure that those who were rising in power would see the benefits of democracy and would naturally turn to the United States. They saw Britain and France as destroying this entire approach and therefore destroying what the Americans are trying to do for the safety of the free world, as it were.
I realize I just said Cordingley. I should have said Keatley, by the way.
Thank you. Can I just ask a wider question? Why do you think it's so difficult for post-war British politicians of both left and right to recognise, as you've said, that Britain can no longer afford a global quasi-imperial foreign policy because of Britain's relative economic decline? You seem to be arguing that Bevin was as culpable as successive Conservative foreign secretaries in this respect. And I should say, for full disclosure, I was a British diplomat for nearly 40 years, and I've always been puzzled at how difficult it is for Britain to position itself. If it is not an imperial power, it must in some way be insignificant, and yet our cultural, our educational, our scientific, our technological, our soft power expertise, and some aspects of our economic strength enable Britain to play a persuasive role in international influence, yet it seems to be very difficult for British politicians to find a way of articulating that.
I think Bevin took the view that the world would be a better place if Britain had more influence in it, which is not a wholly disreputable view. And we now know that the reason that he insisted that Britain had to have her own nuclear bomb was not because of Russia, but because of America. He said, I don't want any of my successors to be spoken to the way the American Secretary of State has just spoken to me. And that's not a wholly ignoble view, and it was beyond what we could manage. But I think most British governments in the immediate post-war period have realized that we couldn't maintain our previous position and have sought to reduce it gradually, but without causing great psychological strains, and if you like, if you want to call it that way, measured decline. But I think the decline stuff is overdone. You see, I think the period 1945 to 55 is the most successful period of British government since the war. I think Britain was then a happy and unified society. And people were realizing, the British public, as I've said, they were always skeptical of all this. They were realizing we had to scale down a bit, but we were still a great country with enormous prestige. And in many ways, I think, a happier country than it was now. I once asked Tony Benn why he called his diaries about the 1950s Days of Hope, or Years of Hope, when Labour was in opposition all that time. And he said, you forget the atmosphere of the period. We thought there was nothing we couldn't do. We'd helped win the war. We'd instituted an improved educational system, a national health service, a welfare state. We'd taken over major industries, run as we thought for the public benefit. We'd got involved in collective security with NATO. We had full employment, moderate trade unions, moderate rate of inflation, rate of economic growth much higher in the 30s, balance of payments turned around by the 1950s. We were an enormously successful country, and I think that's lost a lot of that is lost, I think, in the literature on decline. And I think really what Kathy said, I think the first real intimations of decline came, perhaps wrongly, but with the devaluation of 67, not with Suez, which I think had less effect than perhaps is said. But I think we were a happy and united country, and that's shown by the support for the two major parties. It's a commonplace now in this election to say we've got a multi-party system. In the 1950s, 90-odd% of the public voted Conservative or Labour, and the Labour vote in 51 was higher than 45. They lost the election. The Conservatives in 55 got a higher percentage vote and a higher vote than they got in 51. There was tremendous satisfaction with British government, trust in British politicians, admiration for the leaders, in a way difficult to understand now. I think it was a period of great success, actually.
Gentleman over here.
Sorry.
Not at all.
You answer this one.
Oh, sorry. Did you want to?
No. I'm happy to see what the next question is.
This is a wider question about come to mind civil nuclear R&D in the Anglo-Saxon relationships and the knowledge that they share by the time that an inheritance today's day is Magnus kind of to civil nuclear reactors. And thinking about this, thinking about where we will be looking now at try to find allies to be able to decommission those. Would it be the United States? Would it be France, just to get the expertise, or the taxpayer will end up paying for that decommission?
Adrian, I couldn't quite hear because of the noise there. Could you just tell me what the gentleman said?
Well, it's a general question about the nature of Anglo-American relations today, including making reference to exchange of information and where do we go from here in terms of Britain's future dealings with the United States?
I think one difficulty with Anglo-American relations is that people look at the top. You know, do Obama and Cameron like each other? Do Reagan and is it special because Reagan and Thatcher got along and Kennedy and Macmillan got along and it wasn't bad because it was bad because Nixon and Heath couldn't stand each other. They could hardly be in the same room with each other by the end of their terms. And I myself have difficulty with the term special relationship because it seems to me that throws emotion into it where it does not belong. The one group of people who will not refer to the special relationship are British diplomats, because that means you're supplicating. Strong powers don't need to say, we have a special relationship, unless they want something from you, of course. So I think that actually is a journalistic mistake. The relationship between Britain and the United States is one that has amazing layers of texture. I mean, think of the legal systems. Don't think of the joint history, because until the Second World War, the First World War, the two countries had been fought on different sides more often than they'd fought as allies. So that the sort of looking at history is possibly not a thing that one ought to do if you're going to make an argument about a special relationship. But what one should look at, I think, there is obviously the language, but that also means you can read criticisms as well as good things. So many elements of both governments just work together all the time. From NATO on, excuse me, the two navies are practically interleaving. They work together, they see each other, they know each other's children. The Foreign Office and the State Department exchange interns at ministerial level, not political ministers, but secretary level, one say. So they work together. Indeed, in 1971, Kissinger asked the visiting British Foreign Secretary to draft a possible nuclear treaty with Russia, who had asked for one, and he didn't trust the State Department to do it. The British ability to draft is an element of power. He who drafts controls, I have always thought. In Washington itself, I remember being told by various people in the Army and the State Department and so forth that if there's an issue going on in Washington, for example, especially an international issue, the question is, the White House wants to know, the question is, what does the Army think? What does the National Security Council think? What does Congress think? What does the British Embassy think? In other words, what Kissinger said was that what keeps Britain as a great power is that it seems natural to discuss things with them first, that it would be out of the ordinary if things weren't discussed. And indeed, the difference between the British and the Germans, for example, even nowadays, is that the Germans come and lecture. And the British come and say, we seem to have a problem here. Why don't we try this, this, and this? In other words, they come with possible solutions, not just arguments. Now, one never knows how these things are going, but you know, at that level, at the top level given, and it looks as though it seems pretty clear that Obama and the British government elements aren't that close for all sorts of reasons. But bureaucracies go on. Politicians come and go, but the bureaucracies go on, and habit and inertia are wonderful things. So the Americans come here for the greatest theater district in the world. British go over and run a good many of the American magazines and newspapers. It's just natural for these sorts of things to be together. And I think what I'm trying to say is that the Anglo-American relationship is not special unless you put quotation marks around it. But it is continuing and deep, and I don't know, I mean, and enduring, if there are epiphenomena at the top that kings come and go.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I make another brief point? I mean, it was a great triumph of British policy during this period to get the Americans committed to Europe. The fear after the war was that America would withdraw as she had after the First World War. And at Yalta, I think Roosevelt said he hoped to remove American troops from Europe within 18 months of the end of the war. And to get America involved in the collective security of Europe through NATO was thought to be a great British triumph. And you may argue if we'd had that in the 20s and 30s, Churchill used to say that, we could have avoided the Second World War if America hadn't withdrawn. And you know, if you look at more recent events, if you look at the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, the Americans were involved. Why should anyone in America take an interest in the former Yugoslavia? It's a great sign of change in American attitude. And of course, the Americans are still, 70 years after the end of the war, they're still paying for the defense of Western Europe. It's one of the lovely things about the Americans that they give us lots of money so we can be rude to them. And you know, I think in this period particularly, the immediate years after the war, it was a great triumph of British policy.
Do you not think that also that's partly due to a shift in attitude, primarily as a consequence of necessity? Because if you think about, you know, if you like, the patrician classes between the wars, that Americanophiles, like Churchill, are very much the exception to the rule. I mean, in a way, we come full circle. We come back to Eden, haven't we? Because you know, one of the reasons why Eden resigns as Foreign Secretary in February 1938 is a diplomatic initiative by Roosevelt, which Neville Chamberlain, is very dismissive of. And that's reflective of the fact that he really doesn't have much time for Americans. And if you look at most British politicians, certainly most British prime ministers, I mean, the only one who went to America, the only political leader, was Ramsay MacDonald, that they looked down their noses. So there'd been this brief moment in 1917, 1918, when the Yanks had come over. Interestingly, coming back to a point you made earlier, that the American Navy and the Royal Navy, in that brief time frame, collaborated very, very closely. But if you put that to one side, then there was still a very, as I say, patrician, imperialist, very snooty, sniffy view of the Americans all the way through until the war. And even when you look in the war, it's almost sort of begrudging. I mean, if you read Alan Brooke's diaries, Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, well, you know, it takes a long, long time before there's a shift in attitude such that, well, maybe we could learn something from them, as opposed to a default position of they will always learn something from us.
Absolutely, and you got this immediately after the end of the war, when we wanted a loan, or desperately needed a loan from America. You had the famous couplet, Lord Halifax said to Lord Keynes, they may have the money bags, but we've got the brains. And nevertheless, I think the British leaders in the negotiations thought that Congress was a charitable institution which would prepare to offer free gifts for Britain in return for being insulted, and they found that wasn't the case.
Gentleman here.
I'd be curious to hear about your thoughts about what we can learn from Suez and since in relation to the new superpowers. India and China are coming up. It's interesting you talked about US departments and UK departments working closely together. Now I work in theatre, and you know, Americans are working very closely in the culture industries in China, whereas I almost lost my British accent. There were so few Brits over there currently. And there is almost a sense of, you know, this sense of we are still top dog from the
Sorry,
British. So,
just bring the mic a little bit further away.
is that better? Oh, okay. So, no, so I was just saying that there is still a feeling that, not with the US, but with other people, we're still top dogs, us Brits. And perhaps, and what can one do to, or what is the thinking behind that, possibly? What can we do about this?
Now, I missed the first part. You were saying there's a feeling that people think Britain is still top dog?
No.
I can't believe that.
No.
Well, I
the
missed the
opposite.
first half of what you said.
Okay, I'll just very
You have to be very quick because I'm very
Yeah, no,
low
we're
at the
running out
time.
of time, yes. So, when it comes to new superpowers,
Yeah.
new superpowers think America's top dog.
Yeah.
British people behave if they're top dogs over there, and I wonder if there's anything Brits can learn from Suez to change their attitudes when they deal with new superpowers.
Well, what Britain is doing is being much more accommodating to the new superpowers than the United States is. The new Asian Investment Bank, America was trying to tell its allies don't because it's in competition and we don't know about governments and transparency, and Britain led the rush to become one of the founding members of it. So I'm not sure if that's a lesson from Suez, that it's better to, well, you could say that it's better to cuddle, to insinuate, than it is to try to attack, especially when you don't have the weapons to attack. America is still going to be the top military power for the rest of the century. The advantage is just too great. For all sorts of reasons also within China, which we don't have time to discuss, but I find very interesting. But I think the United States is going to find Britain useful because Britain has a lot more experience over there. And one of the major elements over a century of Anglo-American relations has been the American ability to tap British experience and British knowledge. Languages, for example. Americans don't have many.
Well, it's nothing to do with Suez, but I think the obvious answer is to be nice. Britain should be nicer to students. I mean, the Americans, part of the American prestige is through its top universities. And we, in my view, have a self-defeating policy of restricting students, particularly from India, coming to this country, which is foolish. And I think whatever people think about immigration, I think we shouldn't apply restrictions on immigration to people who are going to be bona fide students in this country. I think you can't overestimate the value of that. And I suspect a good part of the Anglo-American special shouldn't call it that, whatever you call it, comes from Rhodes Scholars at Oxford and the interconnections with the universities. I think one can't overestimate the importance of that. And I think British governments all parts have been very, very short-sighted in relation to students.
One final comment, if I can just say. Britain's major element, as far as I'm concerned, of soft power is the World Service. Without a doubt.
Absolutely.
Well,
BBC in general.
those wise words seem, are appropriate for us to conclude. I think you'd all want to join me in thanking our two distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.